Good morning. I just want to check that everybody can hear me. Am I coming through?
Yes, we hear you.
Great. Okay. I know we're going to have some participants joining, but we want to get started. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar on the Nile Basin, focusing on technical issues. My name is Vincent Ewell, and I'm a hydrogeologist, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. Next slide. I want to thank our sponsors that are listed here, various companies and institutions in the Philadelphia area and actually throughout the United States and globally. I want to just some housekeeping items. We are recording, so this will be a recording. I will ask that participants submit questions in the chat box, not in private chat. The Q&A will be after the four speakers have completed their presentations, and I will be reading each question and directing it to one or more members of the panel. And we'll have four presentations, then we'll follow with Q&A at the end. Our first speaker this morning will be Ambassador Lang Schemerhorn, who is retired from the State Department, former ambassador to Djibouti, also political advisor to the commanding general force in Djibouti, and consulting assignments in various countries in the Nile River Basin. Our second speaker will be Dr. Peter McCormick, who is the Executive Director of the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska. Peter also was the Deputy Director General of Research for IWMI, and was based in Ethiopia for some of that period. He's worked in Eritrea in the private sector, consulting to the government of Eritrea. Dr. Seifu Kabede is an expert isotope hydrogeologist, as well as an expert hydrogeologist, formerly professor at the Addis Ababa University, and currently professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Also participated in the Nile Basin Initiative and is quite active in the International Association of Hydrogeologists. And our last speaker will be Dr. Hani Swalem, who is a professor and managing director of the Department of Engineering Hydrology at Aachen University in Germany, and also the UNESCO Chair in Hydrologic Changes in Water Resources Management. And his research team focuses on flood risk management and water, energy, food nexus issues. So with that, we'll get started. Next slide. And the next slide, please. So just to kind of set the framework here very quickly, we have 11 countries in the Nile Basin, and we're looking at a drainage area of 2,870,000 square kilometers, roughly a third of the continental US area, with a length of 6,800 kilometers, and it being the basin encompasses 10% of the landmass in Africa. Some of the interesting features from an overall geographic perspective: to the south are Lake Victoria, and also the Rift Valley lakes to the west. And then in South Sudan, the Sud Swamp, which is 37,000 square kilometers in area, a huge inland delta. Lake Tana, that headwaters of the Blue Nile in the highlands of Ethiopia. And then, of course, the river course and delta outlet. Next slide. One of the areas of discussion today will be dams on the Nile. This slide shows to the north the Aswan High Dam, and to the south the Owen Falls Dam, and then 4 dams in the Sudan that are used primarily for irrigation, but also I think the Rosarius Dam was raised and used for hydropower. These are not all the dams in the Nile Basin, but just featuring 6 prominent dams. Next slide. And just to look at the average annual precipitation in the basin, from greater than 2,000 in the south and in the Ethiopian highlands to less than 100 millimeters per year in the Sudan, northern Sudan and Egypt. It just kind of gives an overview of precipitation in the Nile Basin watershed. And with that, I will now introduce Ambassador Lang Schimmerhorn, and she will make her presentation. Thank you. Lang, you're on mute.
Now can you, yeah. Good.
Perfect.
It's a pleasure to be here to talk about one of the most interesting and complex regions of the world, the Greater Horn of Africa and Egypt. And you note the term horn comes from the fact that there's part of Somalia that juts out into the Gulf of Aden, south of Yemen and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, sweeping around up the Nile. This is a crossroads area of geophysical diversity, ethnicity, political and military conflict, religion, and provides never-ending challenges for economists, political scientists, historians, scientists of all stripes, and environmentalists now. Next slide, please. The Nile River Basin Initiative countries from 1999 are now 11. 3 countries that are impacted directly by the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, plus 7 other members and 1 observer. I've listed the populations there. You see that for Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, 257.9 million people. You see for the other 8, 288.4. That's a total of 546 million people impacted by this in one way or another. Note the world population is 7.8 billion, the United States 331 million. Next, please. Demographics are one of the most interesting things here. For example, the median age in Africa is 18 years, much lower than any of the other continents, as you can see. Population density there is, for Egypt and Ethiopia, is approaching 300 people square mile. Sudan, much less so, a big territory and some differing topography that means the population is spread out a little more. Of those people in Egypt and Ethiopia, they are mostly within 15 or 20 miles of the banks of the Nile. In Ethiopia, of course, that's different. Now, when you think 18 years median age, that means in the next 15 to 18 years, a lot of people are going to be looking for jobs. Next slide, please. Okay, introducing the territory, you'll cover some of this later on, but basically the Nile is several interconnected systems. Together, they constitute the world's longest river. We'll move on to the next slide. We'll get into some of this later. Next slide, please. Okay, what are the issues? Well, basically, here's Egypt has what it considers an existential necessity, that is keeping the water flowing, and in fact, keeping more water flowing if possible to feed this population. At least 80%, and probably in Egypt, 90% of the population lives on the banks of the Nile. They were the hegemon of the region before. That is fading now, and Ethiopia, among other things, and all of sub-Saharan Africa now, post-colonial period and post 2000, are flexing their muscles and have been making great inroads into increasing well-being for their populations. And once they do that, they want to continue. So Ethiopia is a rising power. It's flexing its muscles, and it's very ambitious to exercise regional and continental political and economic leadership. Next, please. Okay, there are a lot of factors in play here, going back to all of those various scientists and professors who are interested in this area. The newest one now is the COVID-19 devastation, which is challenging the progress that has been made in a lot of areas of well-being and poverty alleviation. But just to enumerate quickly: climate change, environmental degradation, periodic droughts, population pressures, as you can see from the figures, chronic health, economic development. They need value-added manufacturing on the continent to provide jobs for this burgeoning youth population. And of course, all of these factors that are in opposition to each other: security, terrorism, and they're creating refugee and internally displaced people. Next, please. Okay, the other players in Africa. We know, we've been hearing, and you'll hear more later about the negotiations and who involved with that. But in terms of international organizations, the UN, of course, has a presence in virtually all of these countries. And one of its satellite organizations or another, many. The World Bank played host to some negotiations before. While it's not financing directly, it of course is a big factor in financing for this, which Ethiopia wants to do by itself. The African Union, which is currently chairing the negotiations going on. Then there's the sub-regional organization, the acronym is IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority for Development in Djibouti. And then there are the big national state actors: China, Russia, the US, and the European Union. And all of those have had challenging and differing influences over a period of time. It's a constantly changing, it's like the kaleidoscope. You shake it and all the pieces are there, but the picture it's forming is different. And then we have some of the smaller states. Norway has always been interested in water, as I'm sure the hydrologists in the audience know. Somalia has always a big role to play because it engages the other countries one way or another. Turkey has been taking a very much bigger interest in the last 15 years, mainly in religious proselytation, but other reasons, mostly in Somalia, but also in hopefully in some other parts for them. Israel, as you all know, is a leader in water management and development, and they have had a presence in Eritrea for quite a time, and they've been very helpful with Eritrea's development of some water management practices that are cited as things to follow. And I put Japan here because Japan has been funding activities at Djibouti's Scientific Research Institute having to do with water issues. And some of you may know that. Next, please. Well, looking ahead, okay, what makes a successful negotiation? Every party must get something out of it. Winner take all is not an enduring outcome, so we have to think of that. And looking ahead, when the plans for this dam were first put forth, the possibilities of alternative energies were not nearly as great as they are now and are increasingly becoming. So some of the calculus that people put in place to determine the need for the dam and the volume it can produce and so on, maybe are no longer the only game in town. And I leave that up to you to talk about. Because in the Greater Horn in Egypt, there are, of course, strong possibilities, especially for geothermal on the Great Rift Valley, for solar, for wind and wave, which Ethiopia does not have all of those. They don't have the wave, but they've got all of the others. And most of the countries have that. Next, please.
Lang, can
Yes.
you hear me? Just be careful hitting the mic. It's causing some interference.
Okay, and just lastly, just some factors for you to all think about out there of what makes it a difficult environment in which to prosper and negotiate. But there are a couple of books here that might be of interest to tell you things about. One is Eliza Griswold, The 10th Parallel. This is a book talking about the problems of desertification and how it's happening and what the impact it's making. And the title is The Fault Line Between Christianity and Islam, which is moving south all the time. Robert Kaplan's book, many of you may know, Surrender or Starve, is about the Great Famine in the Horn of Africa in the 80s and his travels through there. And then Alan Moorhead, the classic from 1960, talking about the history of
Lang, we're having trouble hearing you again because of the mic noise.
Okay, well, no, that's my last slide. I just put some factors out there that as you're thinking, where can we go with these negotiations, these will be things that play into it for people. Thank you.
Thanks, Lang. Next will be Dr. Peter McCormick, who will be taking a look at some of the history of treaties and allocations, et cetera, within the Nile Basin and agreements. Thanks, Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you all for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. As I'm sitting in the drainage basin of the mighty Missouri, so not quite in the Nile, but certainly a part of the world that I've spent a fair bit of my career, especially in the Blue Nile. I was asked to talk about the agreements and in the Nile and bring everyone sort of up to speed on what sort of agreements there have been. And I really, these are all tie into some of the developments that happened in the river basin over the decades and actually centuries that as the Nile has moved forward. And next slide, please. So I'm just going to provide a broad overview of the agreements and the related developments, talk a little bit about the Nile Basin Initiative, which really kicked off in 1999. And paralleling that, it's considered as part of the Nile Basin Initiative. It's really around developing the treaties, but the comprehensive framework agreement that has continued. And then lessons from other basins. I will touch on this briefly at the end, but then if there's Q&As around this, we can dig into this in some more depth. Next slide, please. So this, it's not quite the same map as we saw before. I'm focusing down more here on the Blue Nile. There are some agreements with the White Nile. I will mention the one or two that are relevant, but I want to specifically focus on the Blue Nile here, as this is the emphasis around the GERD Dam and other developments. But that's not to ignore the other countries in this, and my colleagues in the White Nile River, the White Nile countries will certainly remind me of that. Next slide, please. So just to sort of begin, there is a history of the Nile long before the 1899, but this is really the sort of first major construction across the Nile. This was the Low Aswan Dam, was built for flood control and irrigation, really to regulate the flows, to reduce the peaks and also provide water off-season for irrigation in Egypt, although flood irrigation had been practiced for centuries prior to that. It was then, as Vince mentioned, the height was increased in 1907, 1912, and again in 1929-33, really as the realization that both the benefits, but also the dam itself wasn't really providing the needs of a growing nation. Next slide, please. In 1914 to 1925, and this is in British Sudan, the Sennar Dam was developed. This is in the confluence, just before the confluence between the Blue Nile and the White Nile, just upstream from Khartoum. It was delayed due to the World War I, and then ran into some cost overrun issues. And I mean, this is a challenge in many large civil engineering projects. But this was Sudan beginning to develop mainly for irrigation. The Gezira scheme is downstream of this. and expanding irrigation within Sudan. Again, the river was relatively, the timing of the water wasn't appropriate for full irrigation. By controlling the river, you could actually irrigate more. And although the Gazir scheme has had its challenges over the years. Next slide, please. In 1929, there were some earlier agreements or attempts at agreements, but the first significant agreement was the Nile Waters Agreement in 1929. This was between the president of the Egyptian Council of Ministers, the Egyptian government, and the British High Commissioner in Cairo representing British Sudan. And this assigned water allotments to Sudan and Egypt. And this is the first attempt at an agreement around these on the river. Next slide, please. In the early 1950s, this is us reflecting back through this, there was a Nile Valley plan that had been developed with Egypt to propose to develop a water storage in Ethiopia and Sudan for the benefit of Egypt and Sudan, of course. But the idea here was to provide more storage, more control further up the river system that would benefit Sudan and Egypt downstream. Again, there was various players involved in this, but there was a change in regime in Egypt. King Farouk was overthrown. General Nasser came to power, and in 1954 he identified the High Aswan Dam as the better option for Egypt, primarily around the security of the infrastructure and how they could actually control a reservoir up in Ethiopia. Initially, and this was the geopolitics of the time that Lang was alluding to, the US and the UK pledged to fund part of the dam. At least it was relatively modest amount. But with the changing situation in the region in 1956, the USSR committed to fund the dam. And this was a low interest loan. Now they funded the dam, they were involved in the dam itself, but there was a large presence of Egyptian contractors and consultants involved. So it was very much an Egyptian effort around developing this dam. Next slide, please. So as this dam was being developed, there was also the need to sort of revisit the agreement. The Nile Water Agreement was signed between Egypt and Sudan, laying the groundwork for the High Aswan Dam. So really the piece of paper that was needed before you move forward with that sort of development. And that also included in this was the Rosaries Dam in Sudan. This was upstream of Sennar, again, to address the need for more water in Sudan, to control it, to get the seasonality out of the flows in the river. Note in both these agreements, 1929 and 1959, there was no allocation to upstream countries. So there was no consideration to those countries upstream. Some of those in 1929 were under the authority of the British government. So they were in some ways representing those countries. But again, this is the colonial period, but those countries were never included in these earlier agreements. And the agreement, in the 1959 agreement, there was an understanding that Sudan and Egypt would contest any further developments upstream. Next slide, please. So I think important to this, and I'm not sure when this actually kicked off, but in 1964, the Ethiopian government invited the US Bureau of Reclamation to study the water resources potential of the upper Blue Nile. So realize this is at the time that the Cold War politics in the region are shifting, and the effort to develop the High Aswan Dam had moved from the Western powers to the Soviet Union, and then the US was then involved with this looking at the Blue Nile and the Atbara Basin, which is the river north of the Blue Nile, Atbara and Tekezi River. So certainly this was an existential threat at that time, also looking at what would happen if they went forward with these developments. It was quite a sophisticated study. There was a lot done. It was fascinating. When I worked there in the 1990s, there was a lot of survey data. There was some flow data. Some of the early work had been done by the US Bureau of Reclamation. So it laid the groundwork for some of the later planning and efforts that have been done subsequently. In the Blue Nile itself, and there were various studies, but there was a proposal for 4 dams around hydropower in the Blue Nile Basin. And this included the border dam, which was the furthest down dam. It was the largest one. It was close to the Sudan border, hence the name, the border dam. Next slide, please. In 1960 to 70, the Aswan High Dam was developed. It was 10 years of construction, and it reached its full capacity. It took until 1976 for it to reach its full capacity, and that was 132 billion cubic meters. So this is about double the size of what now the GERD reservoir will be. So these are two very significant reservoirs in the basin. Next slide, please. In 1961 and 66, so this was also under the agreement, was to develop Razeres Dam in Sudan. This was again supported by the British, although Sudan was independent by then. It was originally developed to improve irrigation downstream, mainly through the Sennar Reservoir to control more water into Gezira. And it was retrofitted in 1971 to include hydroelectric power. The dam height there was also raised in 2012. I must admit, I don't know the background to the 2012, but I assume that agreement there was probably something that was part of the Nile Basin Initiative, but others on this call may be able to correct me on that. Next slide, please. In 1999, there was a process had been going on with the World Bank and other external partners in the basin. The Nile Basin Initiative was established then. It included the water ministers of 9. This is what the ambassador had been talking about, 9 countries, with Eritrea being the 10th country in the basin at the time, and it participated as an observer. And actually, that was my first introduction to the Nile Basin efforts by the World Bank, because I had been working in Eritrea and knew some of the key players there, and they were quite keen to then how could they get Eritrea to the table. Obviously, my efforts didn't really bear fruit because Eritrea continues to be an observer rather than a participant. Next slide, please. In 2012, South Sudan joined the NBI, following its independence from Sudan in 2011. So that's the 11 countries that were referred to by the ambassador. Next slide, please. And then 2011, just to put this all in context, the construction of the GERD begins. And the GERD site, it's down there marked in red, that was really very close to, it's about 6 or 7, maybe a bit more than that, a few kilometers away from where the original border site was identified. So it's had a somewhat long gestation, but it's a very similar, the dam, its configuration is different than was anticipated at the time. Next slide, please. So I won't go through the details on this slide. It's a bit crowded, but I wanted to include it in here for those of you interested in this. The Nile Basin Initiative, it really kicked off in 1999. The idea was a shared vision to achieve sustainable socioeconomic development through equitable utilization and benefit from the common Nile water resources. A bit of a mouthful, but essentially the shared vision was to how can they share the benefits? It wasn't really on allocating water, trying to avoid getting into the specifics of the water allocation, but I think that's where we now face that this really has to be part of the final solution in coming to a new agreement. This is worded in different ways by different observers, but there's a cooperation track, which was really a technical track, and this is the Nile Basin Initiative itself, and a negotiation or a political track which was really the development of a cooperative framework agreement. And this is it's a framework rather than a treaty, but the idea was to come up with a framework that the countries could work under. These have been functioning parallel to each other. Just quickly, I will go through the Nile Basin Initiative. There's a list of what the components are around the ministers, the technical advisory committee, which are the key civil servants. There's a secretariat in Entebbe. Professor Sefi Hamad Abdallah is the present executive director. It's a 2-year rotating assignment. And then there's 3 main NBI programs, the shared vision, developing of that vision, and then it's really these 2 components, the Eastern Nile Action Program and the Nile Equatorial Action Program. These have really been bringing the technical parts together and bringing many, so I have Egyptian colleagues and Ethiopian colleagues and colleagues from the different Sudan in Addis Ababa working together on the various technical. And so there was a very good building of linkages between the partner countries or the different agencies in the countries in the Nile. So this was a process that has been going on for a number of years and has built connections between the countries. Again, emphasis on sharing the benefits rather than sharing the water. And I think here it's important to, in the Blue Nile's consideration, the idea there, the conceptualization of what was happening in the Blue Nile was really to look at hydropower development that could generate power for Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt. And that has kind of evolved over the years, but the idea was to share the benefits from these downstream that was one of the key points around the development of these larger dams. Next slide, please. Again, the cooperative framework agreement, so the sort of, how do we get to a treaty, a functioning treaty that all parties can agree to? And this really lays out the rights and obligations for the countries. It would establish a more permanent organization, the Nile River Basin Commission, that would basically take over the role of the NBI and have more authority around this agreement. And one thing that's important here, it incorporates the principles from the UN Watercourse Convention. And all international law around water is a tricky thing to enforce, but this was certainly the conventions and agreements have moved parallel to the developments in the Nile. And in here, some of the language that has caused some heartburn or difficulties in this process of getting to a cooperative framework agreement is the equitable and reasonable use, and then prevention of significant harm. And others on this call will talk more about the details of that, but certainly this is now where there's these divergence of views amongst the various countries. Next slide, please. Again, lots of a bit more detail here, but really beginning it. So the panel of experts on the cooperative framework agreement formed before the Nile Basin Initiative was signed off on. There has been progress there with the negotiations on the technical level, the negotiations at the political level. In about 2009, 2010, this is where the 7 countries, upstream countries, could agree on the text of what was in the agreement. They had a final, there was a reservation really around Sudan and Egypt around the use of the water and the guarantee of flows and other points that again, we'll talk a little bit more later. The 7 countries agreed to the text for signature, and this has moved ahead with the 6 countries signing the CFA in 2010. But only 3 ratifying so far that I'm aware of. I think the agreement called for that 6 had to ratify this agreement before it would be considered agreed. But neither Sudan nor Egypt agreed with these drafts. The one I find also in 2015, an agreement of declaration of principles on the GERD moving forward by with the GERD Dam itself between Egypt and Ethiopia, but that, although that was signed, it's been challenging to, hasn't really clarified the situation. There's still this contentious points in the basin. Next slide, please. So just stepping back a little bit from this, as I was going back through this and reflecting on some of the things that had happened over the years, I think I listed a number of points here. I think one of the things from the Jordan River, the minister there, when I was working on parts of the Jordan River, a point he made to me was that water was although the Jordan River is much more water short than the Nile, it's had a lot of development and certainly it's in a very geopolitically challenging part of the world. But he argued that actually water was one of the few things that Israel and Jordan and others could agree on in that region. Now this is before the present conflicts there, but the point is water they have come to agreements around the water sharing. I think more importantly, and we've talked ahead about Israel being a major source of technical and managerial expertise. Jordan also has quite a bit of, they've done a lot with what the scarce water resources they have, and certainly in terms of managing the demand and using it scarcely, that water reuse and so forth. Jordan has been quite progressive in that area. The Mekong River it goes back earlier than the Nile. It went straight into being a commission. The challenge there, or the issue, was that China never joined, and China has gone ahead. It's the hegemon in the region. It's got the political and the economic clout, but it's also the upstream basin. So it's gone ahead and built the 4 in-stream dams, which contrary to the Mekong River Commission. And in many ways, that has changed how the Mekong has developed. And the Mekong River Commission has been really not too strong, or hasn't been able to hold to what it was trying to do. Colorado River, I was just in the Colorado River last week, and I was just reflecting on some of the things that have happened in the Colorado River. I think this is clearly within one country, although Mexico is downstream, and they certainly have got some challenges around the water coming into Mexico. The thing here is 2 or 3 things that are going on that I think is important for the Nile going forward. One is California, and to basically develop faster. They did agree on allocations, but they got the hydrology calculations wrong at the time, or they were over optimistic. So now the Colorado River has to contend with California using less. But then we've also now seen other states like Arizona having to adjust their water use as well. And now with climate change, we're already seeing the effects of climate change on the water supply availability. All states having to adjust again. So there are some key lessons here. I just overall, as I reflected on this and went back through the Nile Basin development, with including people getting bringing the partners together, I think the Nile itself has done extraordinarily well in moving forward with this. We're in a very tricky time at the moment, but I think the development of the Nile and the progress that has been made, I think has been quite constructive. But certainly we have some challenges ahead of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And with we'll move on to Dr. Seifu Kebede, which will be our 3rd presentation.
Good morning. My name is Seifu Kebede Gumesa. I'm from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. My talk is about the water resources feature of the Nile Basin, with some touch on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. There are 12 countries in the Nile Basin, implicated in the Nile Basin: Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Eritrea, and 7 riparian countries in the equatorial region here. The total population currently in these countries is estimated at 500 million and projected to reach 1 billion by 2050. Regardless of many countries implicated in the Nile Basin, 3 countries feature the most in media outlets: Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. There are 2 reasons for this. The first reason is that 85% of the water flow in the river courses in the Nile come from the Ethiopian highland, 85%. But so the second reason is 100% of this water resource is utilized within Egypt and Sudan. The contribution of Sudan and Egypt is meager, but they use nearly 100% of the water coming from Ethiopia and the equatorial regions. So the strategic interest for Egypt and Sudan is maintaining that status quo of using 100% of the water. And the strategic interest of Ethiopia is to use its water resources for food security and power generation. So what is the current water allocation like? So in 1959, Egypt and Sudan entered into agreement to utilize 100% of the water resources among themselves, 55.5 billion meter cube for Egypt and 18.5 billion meter cube for Sudan. And they allocated nil for the upper riparian countries. There has been no consultation with upper riparian countries or no regard for upper riparian countries in that agreement. But following 1959, there has been many global events, new phenomena, including population growth and large demand, increase in demand for water. Decolonization. Africa has been decolonized after 1959 mostly. And there are other global events that mark this agreement, the 1959 agreement, is not tenable, or the current water allocation is not sustainable. There are many legal, historical, moral background that this cannot be sustained. But for Egypt to maintain the status quo, the hegemony on the Nile, uses diplomatic means, influence riparian countries, other riparian countries, not to sign a comprehensive framework agreement, influence international finance institutions, claim historical rights, and bring forward the water security narrative. Water security for Egypt is equivalent to national security. And in Ethiopia also uses other means to break this status quo and move forward with a utilization of the Nile water. Diplomatic means, advocating for equitable and reasonable sharing following or according to, for instance, the 1997 Convention of UN. And whenever finance is not available for international sources, depend on local sources of financing, like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a $5 billion USD project is financed by Ethiopians. And also bring forward the narrative of poverty. 65 million people of Ethiopia live under the dark. No electricity at all. Dark. And then 10 million people live under permanent food aid. Food imported, from US, Canada, and other countries. How happened that a country that contributes 85% of the flow of the Nile is unable to feed itself and unable to supply electricity for its people? So kind of influencing Ethiopia not to develop these resources is tantamount to keeping 10 million people under food aid and keeping 95 million people in the dark. That is a narrative that Ethiopia brings forward. So we have two competing visions: keeping the status quo and new order in using the Nile water resources. Under water scarce environment, even if the Nile River is the longest river globally, its mean specific discharge is among the smallest. The per capita water availability is among the smallest globally. So how can we reconcile this divergent vision currently and move towards a new future? So there are many measures that needs to be taken: institutional measures and technical measures and political measures. What I'm talking now here is about the technical. Maybe if questions come around the institutional measures, we can discuss it later during the discussion session. Technically, what these countries could do or can do in transitioning from water intensive now to a less water intensive economy in the future is to tap into alternative water sources. What alternative water sources exist currently? One is use of unaccounted water, efficient use of rainfall, groundwater use, desalination, and efficient use of green water. I'll focus mainly on two of these, unaccounted water and groundwater. What happens is, as the river originating from Ethiopia and equatorial regions move through the deserts of Sudan, particularly, large amount of the water is lost into the rocks, into the aquifers. The Nile River water is detected up to 30 kilometers away from the river. There is large seepage loss from the river. And we don't have accurate number on the quantity as of yet, but this is estimated in the order of billions of meter cube of water. So conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater can be one alternative in bridging immediate and medium-term water need in the future. Efficient use of green water, I'll jump this slide. And groundwater, tapping into groundwater resources. Mainly, if you see Egypt and Sudan, there are large, big groundwater bodies. And for instance, the green color here is the boundary of the so-called the Nubian sandstone aquifer. And the amount of fresh water contained in the Nubian sandstone aquifer is commensurate to 500 years of flow of the Nile, minimum. So this can be used for hundreds of years. The thing is, this aquifer is fossil water. It is not connected to present-day recharge. So if you pump it arbitrarily without a plan, you are going to mine it. You are going to deplete it. But we need a kind of international standard, international guideline on the use of this kind of fossil groundwaters for human benefit. Similar aquifers exist in Sudan, like the Rubwa and Gazira formation, and the Bagara formation in Sudan, and shared between Sudan and South Sudan. There is a scope of using these groundwaters for irrigation and other consumptive uses. The figure you see below is the irrigation, the circular areas are irrigation fields tapping from the Nubian aquifer in the western desert. Okay, irrigation has already started, but there is a big scope for scaling this up in the future, until at least the country is transitioning into new water future, less water intensive future, learning from global experience. Finally, about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The Grand Renaissance Dam is a fully hydroelectric dam. It is not consumptive, no irrigation at all. And the dam has, the dam and reservoir has several benefits, including power generation, siltation control for downstream dams, decreasing evaporative water loss in Lake Aswan, flood control in Sudan. The benefits are measurable and evident. Nevertheless, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam remains contentious. Why is it contentious with all these benefits? It is because it marks a new era. It marks an era whereby upper riparian countries prove on the ground that the 1959 agreement is null and void. And that is what creates unease among the Egyptian government and also partly among the Sudanese government. Otherwise, the benefits are reported to be very straightforward. So there are two sticking points. After 10 years of discussion around this dam operation and release rule, feeding rule, they have come to two remaining points to agree upon. Minimum guaranteed flow. Egypt requires certain volume of water to be released. And in case of disagreement on an operation rule, who is going to make arbitration? Is it going to be arbitration, or is it going to be further discussion to follow disagreements? The sticking points are tied up back to the historical right versus equitable and reasonable sharing of the resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seifu. And we will now hear from Dr. Ami Selum from Aachen, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, University in Germany. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the organizers. Thank you also for the previous speakers for giving this overview about the issue. Thank you also for allocating these couple of minutes to me just to give or explain the issue from another angle, because what I heard, it really needs explanation from an Egyptian, more or less, or not an Egyptian or Sudanese, but a downstream country's angle. So if you can move just to the next slide, please. So what you see here is a reality of the water situation in Egypt. And I tried not to use any of my publications or Egyptian publications. I tried to use international organizations as updated as possible, and all of them are available on the database of the FAO, most of them. So Egypt is the driest country in the world, and the total renewable water resources is 58.3 billion cubic meter. 55.5 out of this amount is coming from the River Nile, which represents 97% of the Egyptian resources is based on the Nile. As you can see in the map, the country is really only a strip of green color, and the people are populated around these strips. And the entire country, more than 94% of the country, is just a desert, which is the opposite of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is 94% is green. So annual water shortage in Egypt after recycling agriculture water, because from the calculations, you will never come to 21, you will come to more than 40 PCM as a shortage. If you calculate the water poverty of the people, which is 1,000 cubic meter per capita per year, then you have 21 PCM is shortage that Egypt has to import from abroad in the form of virtual water or food to reach the satisfaction of the people to feed them with the required food. So importing virtual water is what's happening now on the ground. I was not going to speak about the other situation of the water resources in other countries, but I saw some numbers that really needs to see them from a different perspective that were repeated in the previous presentation. So just putting Egypt and Sudan, Egypt was 55.5 share from the River Nile, and Sudan with the 18 PCM, and just putting 10 other countries with 0 PCM. I'm sorry, I have to correct this vision, because first of all, they are not 10 other countries. All what I know are 11 Nile Basin countries, are not 12. But this is not the important part. The important part, when you allocate water resources, you have to consider the green water as well. So you cannot just take the amount of water flowing in the river and you start allocating it. These are two downstream countries are receiving the blue water, but there is a huge potential and amount of green water. So the Nile Basin is receiving 1,660 billion cubic meter. So what is Egypt is getting from this is 3% of this amount. The Nile Basin countries, not the basin, is receiving 7,000 billion cubic meter. So what Egypt is receiving here is only 1% of this amount. So it is not about that the others are getting zero. No, the others, they have plenty of other resources. If I take Ethiopia, for example, Ethiopia receives 936 billion cubic meter of rain. So and that's exactly what makes Ethiopia one of the top 10 exporters of organic food. And that's exactly what makes Ethiopia is the second exporter of coffee. And all of that coffee and food are virtual water. The amount of animals in Ethiopia, which exceeds 80 billion, 80 million animals or heads of animals, this are consuming virtual water more than the amount of water received by Egypt and Sudan. You can get back to the literature on that. We can just move to the next slide, please. So here, the sensitivity of the GERD to the downstream countries. If you can see here in Ethiopia, this is the location of the GERD. At this specific point is responsible for 60% of the water reaching High Aswan Dam or reaching the Egyptian borders. And if you, and just to give you the feeling, one reduction of 1 billion cubic meter from the Egyptian water share will cause reduction of agricultural production of 430 million US$. It will cause reduction of the cropped area by 294,000 fiddan or acre, if you like. It will increase the import in Egypt by 150 million US$. It will affect the agriculture jobs by losing 290,000 jobs. I'm speaking about only 1 billion cubic meter reduction. So it is not about colonization. It is about that we have to see that there is existing uses on the ground, and any change in the amount of water will affect millions of people. My colleague and my brother just mentioned that the key issue in the negotiation is about the minimum guarantee to be released from the GERD. Let me stop at this point. If you see this graph on the left side of the screen, the average flow from the GERD is 49 BCM or billion cubic meter. Egypt was proposing to guarantee that there will be released during the filling and the operation of the 40. And 40 means that Ethiopia, in more than 80% of the hydrological conditions, will be able to fill the dam and to operate the dam. And it's only between 15 to 20% of the hydrological cases that had to be stop or decelerate the filling in order to save the lives in the downstream. So this is the issue. But Ethiopia was given the opportunity for more than 80% of the cases to fill the dam, to accelerate the filling, and to operate the dam, and to generate whatever electricity they want, because Egypt fully understands the need for hydropower for Ethiopia. And we all hope that this electricity or hydropower will be really going for the Ethiopian people, not for export. But this is another topic. And that's why this was the guarantee, minimum guarantee issue. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is a huge dam. I mean, my colleague, Dr. Makon, was talking about the original plan of the GERD. The original plan of the dam was 14 or 16 BCM. Today, we are speaking about 74 billion cubic meter, which means 150% of the average flow of the Blue Nile, which is a huge amount for such a small river. And this also means that this dam, I have to say, is oversized. And please go back to the scientific literature. I give you one example. Professor Asfau Biena from the San Diego University indicated in his publication that this dam is oversized, and this dam will have a very low efficiency of hydropower. So it was promised to produce 6 gigawatt. I don't think it's going to be produced a bit more than 1/3 of this amount, but anyway, my colleague just mentioned siltation control. Siltation control means huge environmental impact on the river. Biodiversity negative impact on the river. So we cannot count siltation control or stopping siltation in the river as one of the advantage for Egypt. We count it as one of the disadvantage for the Sudanese people who are going to lose the fertility of their land over the years. So there are huge environmental impacts on Egypt as well, like salinization of the Nile Delta, and there are many publications on that affecting the biodiversity. Next, please. One of the other options that even Egypt put on the table of the negotiation is to link the two dams, and which is very common practice and known to all the hydrologists and the water resources management or dam operators, not linking them in a physical sense, but in a virtual sense. So which means that we say, we try to maximize the energy for Ethiopia and minimize the impact on Egypt by coordinating the two dams together, which is happening between Egypt and Sudan since 1959. Ethiopia rejected this completely, linking the two dams, which is a very known international practice. So optimize the energy for Ethiopia and optimize or minimize there will be harm anyway for Egypt. And Egypt accepted that there is a harm, but no acceptance for significant harm. This is the key issue. So in Egypt, it's already accepting the existence of the dam will affect the water flowing to Egypt, but mismanagement of the dam will cause definitely significant harm to the two downstream countries. Next, please. So just accepting the filling and operation rules proposed by Ethiopia, I'm not going to go in details because even the time will not allow me, but from the curve on the up left of the screen, this is the filling of the GERD. This is when you don't consider the hydrological conditions of the river. And that's the only request of Egypt. Please, in the dry years, while you are filling, you have two droughts. Artificial drought from the dam because you are cutting volume from the water, and natural drought. So if these two droughts meet, and this is the only point that we cannot reach an agreement. If these two droughts meet, so during the filling, cutting water from the system and the natural drought, then there must be an action here. And that's the key point of not reaching an agreement. What you see here on the left is filling the GERD without considering the hydrological conditions. It's just fixing 5 years. And you can see the line here. The red one is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. So, and that's what's happening on the High Aswan Dam on the right side of the screen. It's depleting as this one goes up, the other one goes down, till it reaches the shutdown of electricity, and then no water to be supplied for the Egyptian population. And that's the very risky, and this is the meaning of significant harm. And in 5 years filling, the deficit for Egypt could be 145 billion cubic meter of water. And you imagine what I mentioned before, the impact of only 1 billion cubic meter. This is of course distributed over 9 years, this 145 billion cubic meter of shortage. Next, please. So just to finalize, I mean, on the table right now as we speak, there is an option and there is an alternative and proposal from Egypt allowing Ethiopia to generate up to 85% in all the hydrological cases. Only this tiny, very limited time of drought and prolonged drought that extends for a longer time, there is a conflict here and missing the opportunity to reach an agreement. But this is possible. I mean, there is a way to reach it. Technically, there is no problem, but there must be a political will. There must be commitment to reach a binding agreement, not guideline, as my colleagues are expecting. There is a need to reach a binding agreement. There is a must to recognize existing uses and not call it colonization. These are people connected their life to the amount of water coming from the Blue Nile. It has nothing to do with colonization. It has something to do with the life of the Egyptian peoples. So one thing that really shows that are we really speaking about a hydropower dam? The statement a couple of days ago from His Excellency, the Ethiopian Minister of Foreign Affairs, that in the Twitter that you can go and visit and see it, after the unilateral action of filling the dam in the first stage, congratulations, he said, I'm quoting him, congratulations, it was the Nile River and the river became a lake. It will no longer flow into the river. Ethiopia will have all the development it wants from it. In fact, the Nile is ours. This is a very disturbing message. Thank you very much. I finished. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to move on to the question answer period. And we'll start we're going to start with Peter's talk. I think John Pash, if you don't mind, I'm going to mention if people don't mind, I'll mention who asked questions. There was a question from John Pash to Peter regarding talking a little bit about the current risks and threats to the status quo on the Nile Basin, where dialogue / policy / negotiation should focus now. And that's directed towards Peter McCormick. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, John. I think he's gone off actually. I think what we're in, and you know, all water is political in the end. So I think we're in very much in this political, very challenging position. And I agree with with Dr. Sewell that we technically, many of the things it depends on how you cut the numbers, but certainly I think most of us are sort of agreeing on where we are with the numbers. It's then how you interpret that and what how then this is interpreted in the agreements. I think that I find the press in both countries, or in all three countries, it tends to be it's political, and then the press, the media dialogue around this. So it is a very difficult time. It's actually quite there is a real threat here that this. Of conflict, I'm not so sure, but certainly this conflict in terms of the work that's been done to build the partnerships in the basins over the years are quite encouraging, but this is certainly going to be a contentious point that's going to make it more challenging to address some of the other issues in the Nile. I think going forward, and I was reading maybe another question of John's, he was talking about where the other threats are, and I do think the threat that was highlighted by by Hani in this last presentation is around the food security and realizing, and this is drawing on some of the other basins that have been more water scarce, ultimately food security, and that's driving also in Ethiopia. It's Sudan. Sudan is yes, they are supportive on one side, but they have plans for irrigation upstream of Eritrea's dam and quite significant developments. Food security is a big challenge in this basin. And if you then look at the actual availability of water in all of these countries are very close to being defined as water scarce. Ethiopia is close to 1,000 cubic meters of fresh water per capita per year. And recognizing that without the Nile, Egypt has very little, has few resources. So the reality is food security is probably the one where in addressing that, that's a massive threat to the water resources and how to address that going forward. I'm recognizing that it's very closely linked to the energy requirements. When we start developing groundwater, we have to pump it, and energy has to come from somewhere. So we end up getting ourselves into a circuitous challenge around developing our food and managing our water resources. So I think those are the challenges I see going forward, and realizing that ultimately these have to be negotiated and sorted out and in part understood in these agreements. But I'll go back to what I was saying at the end of my presentation. A lot of good work has been done in the last two decades, and we should build on that.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We have a question from Pam Lazos, which is that even with, I think, let me read the question, then we'll see who it goes to. Even with all the water efforts, treaties, initiatives, et cetera, isn't there still going to be not enough water for all of the energy, agriculture, and person needs of the populace? And if so, what next, especially as climate changes caused by the Earth's warming are getting more severe? I think I'll direct that to Dr. Seifu. and then we can go from there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it is a very key question to be, addressed. There is no straightforward answer for this. Nevertheless, our role as professionals, as scientists, is to answer that. It's not to fight on numbers. It's not to fight on, nitty-gritty details and giving wrong impression that one country is acting against the other. I think the first thing is political will. If there is political will, countries can come together and address their challenges they are facing. Second, following political will is institutional. They have to make sure that they have in place institutions that are established, legally binding institutions that address these key challenges. We are operating in an environment where water scarcity is severe, but no river basin commission. It is a bit worrisome. And then comes the technical solutions. I think there is ample technical opportunities in our hand, at least to address the immediate and medium-term problems we have. The countries must transition into low water-intensive environment. Stop flood irrigation. Stop flood irrigation of rice in deserts. Stop sugarcane irrigation in deserts. Stop cotton irrigation in deserts. These are the kinds of things, supply side measures, demand side measures that could be taken. And having said this, I don't want to enter into polemic about numbers. This is a kind of debate which is very tiresome, very tiring. For instance, rainfall. If you take rainfall, it is true, 900 billion meter cube of rainfall, Ethiopia get that amount of rainfall annually. But that doesn't mean it is a water resource. It becomes a resource after you subtract the non-essential evapotranspiration that you cannot avoid. In Ethiopia, 18 million hectares of land is being being farmed. And there is no other scope to expand this irrigation area. And then you cannot stop the non-essential evapotranspiration. You can improve on that. So rainwater should not be considered as a resource. Second, filling the total volume of annual flow of the Nile is like 50 billion meter cube. It is not 10 times, the storage is not 10 times larger than that. It is just 1.2 times larger. So me and my colleague or whoever sitting here, these numbers should come through institutional mechanisms. And some countries are deliberately working against establishing institutions, withdrawing from institutions. And the numbers that come also are kind of not from international panel of experts. Don't trust my numbers. Don't trust the numbers that are presented to you here, unless otherwise they come from through institutional mechanisms. So political will, institutional mechanisms, and technical, that can at least bring the countries into the immediate and near-term solutions. The long-term solution, move away from water-intensive economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Seifu. Question for Dr. Honey from Bate. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Taking into consideration losses due to evapotranspiration in the Nile system, where would be better to place for storage by reservoirs? The decision to construct the High Aswan Dam was based on its location with Egypt's territorial control. Doesn't other upstream reservoirs make more hydrologic sense from the perspective of minimizing losses to evapotranspiration? And that's directed towards Dr. Honey.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. There is a lot to be done. Again, as my brother said, if there is a political will, is there. If the engineers or the technical people are solving the problems and they are giving free hand, there is a lot to be done. But if we cannot agree on filling a dam since 10 years, do you think just shifting the volume stored upstream, the highest one dam somewhere else, will be a realistic solution? I mean, we need to discuss whether it's really going to be realistic to save evaporation. I don't think so, but even shifting it from this location to another one, and we are not able to fill a dam, I think for the political situation right now, it's difficult to think in this way. But the highest one dam was established, and we need to know this, when the Egyptian population was 20 million inhabitants. Now the Egyptians are 104 million living only because High Aswan Dam is there. If the 80s drought happened without High Aswan Dam, they could have really killed, or many people were going to suffer from lack of water, and we're going to have a disaster in Egypt. So High Aswan Dam protected Egypt from huge, not only flood, but droughts. Droughts are more severe and more important for the Egyptians. So yes, building a dam with a storage that is added to the system, if it's really controlled by all the countries together and people are allowing each other to contribute in the operation, might help. But in the current situation, it's just having a disadvantage for at least Egypt as a downstream country. But if we start speaking about saving waters and we start shifting here, stop growing rice in the desert, there is no growing rice in the desert in Egypt. Rice has been used to grow in the delta, and this has been stopped. So this is something. But I can also continue going in this direction, but I think it's not going to bring us anywhere. Stop also growing biofuel and exporting virtual water for the people to drive their cars and grow food if we are claiming that food security is an issue. So we have to stop also growing biofuel. Moving from surface irrigation in Egypt, because this also was mentioned, to modern irrigation. Actually, it's happening right now, quickly. I tell you, as an engineer, this will cause a lot of problems in the future, because the irrigation in the delta, this very tiny area, is the only source to recharge the groundwater aquifer. And if you stop recharging the groundwater aquifer and the people are pumping water in other locations, this water will deplete the groundwater level, which will cause saltwater intrusion from the Mediterranean Sea that's raising every year a couple of centimeters. So we need to see the holistic, sustainable way of managing resources. Yes, the government in Egypt is moving towards modern irrigation, but I tell you, as a scientist, this is going to have a lot of environmental problems in the future. And
Okay.
the last point, if you allow me, just the last point.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions, so I want to stay with the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to a question for Ambassador Schemerhorn, because it's more in the political realm. And this is from Cloud Beta, asking whether Ambassador Schemerhorn could provide any insight on the interlinkage between the U.S.-sponsored negotiations on the GERD and the efforts of the United States to secure Egypt's buy-in to the Israeli-Palestinian peace proposal from the Trump administration. And it's your choice whether you want to address this, Lang. It's rather, yeah. Lang, are you on? I don't see Lang. Okay. She may have had an internet problem. So we will go back to, and I'm going to have this question addressed to Dr. Hani and also Dr. Seifu. This is from Dennis Warner. Dennis, how you doing? Do we expect the downstream countries, Sudan and Egypt, to increase groundwater extraction from larger aquifers in the coming years? What would be the major constraints? So I'd like to get Dr. Hani's input on this, as well as Dr. Seifu's, and then since I kind of like the area groundwater, I'll also talk. So Dr. Hani, you're on board first.
I don't believe that this water in the sandstone aquifer is enough for 500 years, and we have indicators for that. My brother from the South African University, he showed the map of central pivot irrigation. My friend, this central pivot irrigation, if you zoom in many areas, you will find salt accumulation. And this salt accumulation is coming from depleting the groundwater level, and the salinity of the groundwater is increasing in many locations. I give you very clear and well-known example. If you travel from Cairo to Alexandria and you see this Western Desert side, and this huge billions of dollars of land reclamation and agriculture projects, when I graduated some years ago, many years ago, this was a very high quality groundwater. Today, after a bit more than 25 years, this is bringing water to desalination stations, which means that the groundwater increased salinity by 200,000 ppm. So the potential for groundwater is not as we can imagine. This is one point. And the second point, it has to be managed in a very sustainable way. We have to calculate it in a very careful way in order to be managed. And this does not mean that Egypt is not using groundwater. Egypt is using groundwater, and it's in the water balance that I showed. So there is an amount of water used for the groundwater, but increasing it will threaten the quality of the groundwater in the country. Thank you.
Yeah, Vince, can you repeat the question? I could guess the question from the answer from Prof.
It was
Suleiman,
in terms of Sudan and Egypt increasing the groundwater extraction from the larger aquifers in the coming years. What will be the major constraints? And I'm assuming we're talking mostly the Nubian and then the aquifer that you mentioned in the Sudan. Yeah.
Yes, I think studies dating back from 1960s and 1970s, 80s characterized very well these large aquifers in Northern Africa. And I would say the major constraint, number one, for me is sustainability. You know, I should not, I'm a groundwater person, I should not say go and pump it, yeah? But this kind of water can be used as a vehicle to transition into the future. And the major constraint for me is the depletion. So if you pump, you will deplete it. So we need to have a mechanism in place. How to deplete, we call it managed depletion. This is an agreed upon guideline in place already, like by the, for instance, the World Bank, managed depletion of fossil groundwaters. So that is, the depletion is a major constraint. And I don't think technological constraints are there because in many places, this groundwater crop out on the surface in forms of oases, like in Baharea, Farafara, in many places, Oinat, it crops up.
Seifu, can you hear me? I think we may have lost you. Yeah. All right, I'm going to add on to the question, and then if Seifu reconnects, we can oh, there.
So,
That's it. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Seifu. Oops. Can you hear us? No, he's.
yes,
okay.
yes, I can hear you now. I don't know where I have stopped, but this groundwater can be used an option to address the immediate and medium-term problems that countries may face. So, but doing this requires institutions. That is what I want to underline again. Institutions in place who quantify what resources we have in the basin and how can we take the supply side measures, the demand side measures, and move forward. Currently, we don't have that. It is a bit strange. We don't have a comprehensive framework agreement. We don't have a comprehensive framework agreement that leads us toward this basin scale water resources management. We don't have that in place. We need that. And brothers from Sudan and Egypt should come on board and play constructive role there. They have the technical capacities. They have the know-how of water resources management. They have to come on board and rejoin the Nile Basin Initiative and contribute to the formation of a River Basin Commission. In that way, you know, the heated discussion about the GERD, that is not going to imprison us. Okay, we need that. Institutional constraint is the second one next to the sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, I want to move on to a question from Nafisaya Ba, and I again apologize. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name, but this is coming from West Africa, and that's that government conflicts and civil conflicts are limitations to development of groundwater dams at all in West Africa. And I think we're talking primarily the Niger River Basin. How do you deal with this issue? This is addressed to Dr. Seifu. And I just want to point out that I think there's a dam currently under consideration in Niger and Tilbury region at the border with Mali, which is a rather tenuous place to be these days. But in any event, Dr. Seifu, I'll let you take that question.
Sorry, can you simplify the question? I didn't get really the question, Vince.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, governmental conflicts and civil conflicts are limitations to the development of groundwater / dams et al. In West Africa. How do you deal with this issue, Dr. Seifu?
Yeah, I think managing conflicts it requires institutions. Again, I go back to the same answer. You know, whenever you face conflict on water scarcity, you need a mechanism in place. First, management mechanism, and then a mechanism to address the causes of those conflicts. I think this is a general conflicts should be addressed before they escalate into the next stage. Yeah, that is what I can say.
Okay. This is probably going to be our last question, and it's one that from Yana Kwa, and it's also one that I wanted to address to both Dr. Hani and Dr. Seifu. In terms of supply solutions, I am curious to hear opinions on how feasible it is to replicate a similar water recycling system as is in Singapore. I think there's a lot of potential for increasing water supply, but not here in many places recycling sewage water. And I wanted to address that in the context of Addis Ababa, in the context of Khartoum and Cairo wastewater reuse. And this is being done, as I'm sure both of you know, Dr. Hani and Seifu, and it's been done in Windhoek for over, I think, half a century. And I think many people feel it's the future. So I think, Dr. Hani, your response first, and then Dr. Seifu's, and I think Zoom is going to cut us off.
Okay. Water recycling is, of course, a very, very important issue and considered for Egypt in the water balance equation. So when I presented the first slide, there was the water coming to Egypt, renewable water is 58 BCM, 55.5 is coming from the river Nile. And if we consider the 1,000 cubic meter per capita, then you need for Egyptians right now 105 to 110 billion cubic meter, and you don't have this water. This proves that there is a water recycling happening mainly in the agriculture sector, of course, in the sewage system. whether there is still potential to recycle more water. Yes, there is a potential to recycle more water. It's just about the cost. If you can hear also and read in the media, Egypt has a plan 2037 to increase enormously the amount of water treatment stations for the sewage water, but also for the quality of recycling agricultural water, which is happening right now, in addition to desalination. Because we believe, regardless the issue of the GERD, the number of population in Egypt is increasing also enormously. And if we cannot decelerate this increase of population, we still have to find other resources for the increasing number of population. So I think Egypt is taking steps, but there is still some things to be done. Need technology, need more research, R&D in the country, and I totally agree with my colleague Kebeda that collaboration together is an issue. Institution collaboration, I totally agree also with him. But the CFA, you know, there is also again a political issues that we don't want to get into. There is an international law that has to be applied in this CFA to be able to apply it. So you cannot just ignore the existing uses. You need to consider them and avoid significant harm before applying the CFA. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Saiful?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is an area that requires, for Ethiopia at least, some technical support, particularly urban water reuse is a new area, a new domain in Ethiopia. And the city like Addis, it is happening. They are trying to recycle and reuse water, but scaling this up at national scale, particularly for urban water use, remains a big technical and also investment requirements, but there is a big scope to do that. Nevertheless, I want to also underline one of the more progressive steps that Ethiopia is currently taking since nearly 15 years is the sustainable land management. Sustainable land management through soil and water conservation practices in mountain environment, in the highlands. Farmers, individual farmers contribute up to 60 days of their labor for soil and water conservation work. This is an enormous job. And you see already the positive benefit of this. And you know, initially when the Nile Basin Initiative was formed, and then they were thinking about what kind of projects countries could do together, sustainable watershed management project was identified as one of the key areas of intervention. And at the beginning, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia collaborated on this kind of projects. And there is a big scope to, you know, to maintain this activity in the future of water harvesting in Ethiopia, particularly for smallholder household irrigation purposes. You know, guys, people listening here, I think the issue around the GERD should not imprison us. The region needs technical support. The region needs institutions. The region needs solutions. Fighting on the GERD is going to escalate the things. And I think there is a scope for a better future, a better shared vision for everybody in that environment. Around water, we can create peace. Thank you very much.
Thank everybody. I think we've reached the end of the webinar. I want to thank all the presenters and of course, all the attendees. And we'll wish you a good day and thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Vivian, thanks. Dr. Hani, nice meeting you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Kebeda.
Thank
Okay.
you, Hani. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Thanks, Seifu. Thanks, Peter. And